Today on episode 22 of the podcast, we are talking about guilty pleasure films. So we're going to break down our favorite guilty pleasure movies and talk about what it means to be a guilty pleasure. I'm Brad, this is Josh, and welcome to We'll Bring the Popcorn.
Today we're talking about guilty pleasure movies. Now, guilty pleasure can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? So we both put together a list of films that we consider our guilty pleasure movies, but I kind of wanted to at least go through the dialogue of what makes a guilty pleasure film, because it could mean something different for you. It could mean something different for me. Yeah. With both of us putting together our own list, I know we both use different criteria for what we consider to be a guilty pleasure film. I know for me personally, a guilty pleasure for me is probably a film that I really enjoy, but doesn't necessarily get talked about in day-to-day conversations, right? Like when you're hanging out, it's stereotypical to say at the water cooler talking about movies that you've seen, but even in like regular everyday conversations, there's films that, you know, my friends and I, when we get together, we'll still quote like 20 years after the movies come out and kind of, you know, say some of the funny lines and catchphrases and work them into regular conversations. Those are guilty pleasures for me. But films that, like, maybe in the popular lexicon of great films and what a great film is, it's probably never going to be on anybody's top 10 overall list. Mm-hmm. But those are what I consider to be guilty pleasure movies for me. Like, they're films that I consider them kind of like comfort films, too. They're like, okay, it's a cold day. I'm not going anywhere. It's snowing outside. I'm hunkered down at the house. Is it something I'm going to put on? And I don't want to list films like some of the bigger tentpole films like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or some of these big grandiose films that you can binge an entire day watching, but something you could put on for like an hour or two to just kind of turn your brain off and find some comfort in.
Yeah, because looking at guilty pleasures for me, it's like, are they films that didn't do very well in theaters? Maybe they weren't critically reviewed very well. Maybe they didn't make a whole lot of money. Maybe just not a lot of people know of it. Sure. Maybe they're more cult classics, something like that. But they all are, to me, ones that you can put on and watch over and over again. So they're not exactly like, we've talked about how we're big fans of Lord of the Rings films, and I wouldn't call them guilty pleasures because they're so incredible and huge box office, rave reviews and everything else, but it's something I'll watch often. I think of more of the films that maybe it didn't get reviewed very well or didn't have a huge box office or something like that may be more obscure and not everybody kind of knows about them, but they're ones that I will love to watch and tell people about, how I enjoy them. Because there's some that I have on my list that they did extremely well in theaters, but most of the talk that if I see any talk about, is how bad the movie was.
Sure, and then that's perfectly good criteria as well. And I'd be curious to see what anybody watching this video thinks is like what defines a guilty pleasure movie for you as well. And that's what's going to make this conversation that we're about to have kind of fun, because it's not our usual news review format, but it's kind of we're both big fans of film. Obviously, that's the whole reason we're doing the podcast, right? So to kind of talk about some of these films that we love that don't necessarily get a lot of love in return, but they're films that we like for one various reason or another. It's fun to talk about those types of films, and I'm excited to kind of get in because we put together kind of our own separate lists and kind of compared them. There's actually a little bit of overlap, but there's a lot of different films between the two of us that I think is kind of interesting in, the way you view a film versus the way I view a film. And I think that the fact that we can kind of come together and talk about it is kind of the whole, inspiration to do this to begin with, right? So we do have in a lot of ways, we do have very similar tastes in music, or not music, but movies. But at the same time, there are things that we can both agree on, but we both have our own different things we like to branch off and watch on our own that, it's fun to kind of talk about. And I'm excited to kind of dive into this list. So if you wanted to kick off and talk about your first one, let's start about one that made your list.
Yeah, I'll start it off with one of my probably favorite guilty pleasure films. Like, we're not putting these in any particular order, just kind of how we want to talk about them. But Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, came out in the early 90s. You had Kevin Costner, who the 90s was like 80s and 90s was his time for Field of Dreams and Bull Durham and Dances with Wolves and, you know, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. But this is also one I feel that is more critically panned and more people talk negatively about. And it was like the third highest grossing movie that year. It made a lot of money, but I think one of the main reasons why it got so kind of fans and critics not liking, Kevin Costner couldn't keep an accent. Like the way he talks throughout the movie changes all the time. Like he'll try to do an English accent, then he goes to being just Kevin Costner. Then he'll try a little bit different kind of accent, and then he's back to being Kevin Costner. And he flip-flops a lot. Like this is a film I love. I had one of my uncles who kind of got me hooked on this film when I was younger because it was a darker, kind of violent movie. Like you wouldn't take it as serious as like some films are done this day, because also I have to give up to Alan Rickman, one of my favorite actors.
Fantastic.
He was unbelievably over the top of the Sheriff of Nottingham in here. Like he was silly and goofy and a ton of fun, while, you know, like Morgan Freeman is in it. He's more of a straight-laced character who's in it, but there's also some bad editing in the movie too. So like it starts off in the prison. And so there's a scene where they're kind of breaking out, and, you know, Robin has started this breakout, and he's, you know, Morgan Freeman's character is chained up, and he's standing up, chained up with his hands together like this. And he's asking for Kevin Costner's character, you know, with Robin Hood, to come free him. And he's like, "Free these shackles, Christian," with his arms spread wide, and then immediately cut back to him standing and his hands are together. Like they were two completely different scenes that they put together, because he didn't even look the same in both of them. Like between Kevin Costner's disappearing accent and some kind of bad edits, like it was mostly not well reviewed, but I absolutely love the movie.
Yeah, and it's one that I enjoyed as well. Like I'll always remember one quote from that film that, for whatever reason, always, you know, stuck with me, was Alan Rickman in particular. Like, "I'll eat your heart out with a spoon," you know, like it's some variation of that.
Why would you do that? Because it'll hurt more.
Right? Yeah. It for whatever reason, that quote stuck with me forever. But it is one of those. It's a lot of big names in that film, like you said. You got Kevin Costner, you got Morgan Freeman, you got Alan Rickman, you got Christian Slater as well in that film. Like it's a lot of like really popular actors at that time, and it did, like you said, commercially it did very well. But it was one of those that was popular in spite of what critics may have thought about the film at the time. And it's something that I actually haven't gone back and watched it in a while. I'd be curious to, you know, now that we're doing deeper dives into films and reviews and stuff that we're doing now for the podcast, if I go back and watch it, how I'd feel about the film now.
I just watched it 3 days ago.
Yeah, it's been a little while. I'd say it's been probably 10 to 15 years since I've seen the movie. So I would love to go back and revisit it and kind of talk about it. But that's very good criteria for a guilty pleasure film for you. Like you said, you just recently went back and watched it.
I will watch it probably at least once a year.
Yeah.
Because I enjoy it and love it so much. It's got the goofiness, silliness. I love the Friar Tuck that they did in there. You know, Christian Slater's Will Scarlet, he kind of tried to do an accent, but it was kind of him and Kevin Costner. Everyone else has, you know, proper European accents, or at least attempting to do one. And they're both kind of, well, yours is a little weird, and you're just Kevin Costner right now. But it just, I just loved what they did with it. Like, there was just so much fun and enjoyable to me. And like, it made a lot of money, but not a lot of people enjoy it. But it's one I will watch once a year and just love it every time I watch it. And it also had one of the biggest songs of the 90s, Bryan Adams. Just that song was everywhere for so long, and it just, I have such fond memory. It kind of takes me back to my childhood, saying it's a dark, violent movie that I watched as a child.
Takes me back to a child.
It takes me back to the childhood times, it's just my younger times, I could say.
Sure,
That I enjoy that movie so much.
But that's exactly the whole point of this list, right? Like, it's for all those reasons why it couldn't have. It's like you said, it's not going to make anybody's top 10 films of all time, but it's a film you'll still come back and watch from time to time. Like you said, you're watching it once a year. I think that makes it a great candidate as like a guilty pleasure film for you. You know what I mean? And hopefully us talking about some of these films, it encourages people to kind of go out and check out these films as well, either if they haven't, or kind of revisit them. Like, we all have those movies that we like to fall back on. Like, I hear all the time, like, oh, I can throw this movie on in the background while I'm cleaning the house and doing my stuff, and I'll do that and watch the film that way, or at least have it on. These are great candidates, and I think that's a great one to kind of start off this list and get to kind of talk about. I wanted to throw a completely 180 from a darker, more serious film to one of my personal favorite comedies of all time, which is Friday. So Friday starred Ice Cube, Chris Tucker, Tiny Lister, among many other people. The movie is absolutely hilarious and absurd, talking about, growing up in, South Central Los Angeles, and the main character, Craig, who's played by Ice Cube, gets fired on his day off. And there's so many memeable, gifable moments from that film that people still use today. And it's such a quotable film to this point. Spoiler alert, a lot of my films are going to be very quotable and things that I, will say and quote. But Friday is one of those films that you want to talk about a cult classic comedy film. Friday absolutely fits the definition of that for me, and it's one that if I just need like a real quick laugh or something, like that's a film that I'll throw on that or watch when it comes on, like USA, when USA airs it every once in a while too. I'll throw it on and just laugh. I mean, people still use the phrase "Bye Felicia" like all the time, and that came from that film. That's where that phrase originated from. So there's so much vernacular and, quotes from that film that people still use today. And it's a film that I just love to randomly throw on.
Honestly, I couldn't tell you the last time I watched Friday. I enjoyed it too. It's something from when we were younger that was fun. First thing I can remember really seeing Chris Tucker in, who also I'll be talking about him in one of my other guilty pleasure films that I first saw him in Friday, but that's where he really exploded in this other one. But yeah, it's a ton of fun. I think it helped bring a lot of people's into the forefront from that movie. Yeah,
and it spawned a couple of sequels as well, and it helped launch the careers of quite a few comedians that are still touring to this day, right? Like Mike Epps is somebody who played in one of the sequels to the film that's in there. Cat Williams became like mega famous coming out of that film as well. Like it helped launch a lot of people. But like you said, Chris Tucker became a global superstar for playing Smokey in that film. It was kind of a launching pad for him to eventually move on to Rush Hour and the film that you're going to talk about on your list as well. But this is like that first big blow up film, and it's such a good, like it still holds up as a good film now. Just talking about just a regular Friday in South Central Los Angeles, right?
Talking about Friday made me think of one of the most ridiculous, and it could be a guilty pleasure for a lot of people, though. One of the most ridiculous titles from around that time was "Don't Be a Menace to South Central while drinking your juice in the hood." Like that was one of the most ridiculous titled movies ever, but it's memorable that I'm still thinking about it today. Exactly. And it popped in my head when we're talking about Friday. Like it just, that probably could be many people. It could be a guilty pleasure for that. But yeah, Friday was such a good film that just, it wasn't something of that time that you were expecting to see. Like it just came out and it went, kind of big for everybody, but I still think it's a cult classic to a lot of people.
Yeah, because it's not one of those like universally praised, critically acclaimed films, but it's such a well-written, smart, funny film that I think it still stands the test of time. Like I said, I will throw it on a random Friday of all things or something. Like if I'm not going out or doing something, and it's one of those movies that as I'm channel surfing, if like, oh, USA's got it for, the next 2 hours. If I'm not doing it, I might leave it on while I, do things around the house and just have it on. That's one of those types of films for me. And like I said, just the quotes from that film.
You said the memes everywhere, like the Chris Tucker reaction. Everything.
Yeah, that, like, it's a very gifable movie. And then, like I said, "Bye Felicia" becoming such a popular phrase in pop culture that came from that film. And that's just goes to show some of the staying power of that film. But it's so good and so funny. I love that movie so much.
I'm going to go ahead and use that to transition into my next one I want to talk about because of Chris Tucker, where I think if, Friday started, this is one that helped skyrocket him, even though I still feel it's a cult classic movie, that it did decent. It didn't do great in theaters, but it was a Fifth Element.
Yep.
So this is, Bruce Willis, Mila Jovovich, Chris Tucker Ian Holm, like it had a star-studded cast, but it is a silly, goofy sci-fi movie. It's cheesy. It's got bad acting. Like I know the actress passed away now who played the president, but you know, I'll even be quoting the president just because he's such a deadpan and all my fellow citizens. And it's like but it's a cult classic. Like I know there's a lot of people who's heard of it, knows this movie, but it's one I will watch once, twice a year if it's on, which it does re-air a lot. I will turn it on. It's one of my favorite films of all time. I put this high on my list, even my top 5, but I still consider it a guilty pleasure because it is so cheesy, goofy, silly, over the top, bad acting, but it's a great film because of that.
Yeah, and that knowing you as well as I know you, it makes total sense that that's on your list because it does fit your personality a lot, and it's definitely a silly film in a lot of different ways. So over the top, so overacted in a lot of places, but it's fun. Like you said, it's such a fun movie to watch, and it's funny you mentioned that too because I almost put it on my list as well because it is such a silly, over the top, like we said, film, and it helped really launch Mila Jovovich into the Resident Evil films that she became, probably most popular for starring.
I think she was like 18, 19 years old when she did this movie.
Mm-hmm. So it kind of helped push her into a higher spotlight to move on to take, the role like that she became a global megastar at that point for starring in. And, it's so, even Gary Oldman.
Oh yeah, Gary Oldman being the over-the-top villain with his accent and his bad haircut with the whatever reason plastic sheet on his head, but I fell in love with Gary Oldman from that movie too. I think at that age I wasn't seeing a lot of stuff that he was in at that point, but yeah, he was so brilliant as our main antagonist to the movie. But even like I mentioned with Chris Tucker, his Ruby Rudd was like so over the top. Like he's a radio personality that's wearing outlandish outfits and just going over the top, and he's a scaredy cat, but he owned that role. Like if you think of The Fifth Element, you're thinking of Mila and you're thinking of Chris Tucker and what they did in that movie, because he was so ridiculous, but he owned every second of that ridiculousness that he did. It's so good. It's
so good, but yeah, that's another great example of a guilty pleasure film, right? So that's one. It's probably not going to make the list of greatest Bruce Willis films, even if you were to put a list of them together, right? But it's definitely one that's worth going back and watching just for the laughs alone. We have, between the two of us, we have some pretty silly, funny comedy because a lot of our humor is going to be shown in a lot of these films that we put on our list because they do shape kind of, in a lot of ways, our senses of humor, just in the types of things that we, the way we talk, the way we act, especially when, the camera's not rolling, but it does make perfect sense that that's on your list, and I'm glad you put that on there.
I absolutely love it. I can't get enough of watching that movie. I've bought it. I think I've bought every version from HD DVD to Blu-ray to 4K. Like I own multiple copies of this movie.
I love that. But that's guilty pleasure, right? That's kind of the textbook definition of it. It's one that it's nobody's ever really talking about too much, but it's one that holds a meaning to you and kind of is like, okay, if you want to put me into a film, this is kind of the film that I would be in. You know what I mean? So it makes a ton of sense. That's definitely a fun one that, worth going back and watching again if you haven't watched it in a long time, for sure. One of the things I wanted to transition to next from mine, I'm going to move away from comedy a little bit because we're going to talk about comedy enough and kind of go back to it. But one that kind of holds a little bit of a sentimental guilty pleasure for me is I love a good sports movie. I really do. Some of my favorite movies are sports movies. And one of my favorites is Bull Durham. Now, Bull Durham is another Kevin Costner film. It also has Susan Sarandon's in the movie. Tim Robbins is in the movie. This is the movie where Tim Robbins and Susan Sarandon met and became married from starring in together. But it's a baseball movie about the Durham Bulls and, an old catcher in Kevin Costner, who's kind of a career minor leaguer, is asked to mentor Tim Robbins, who's this young, hot prospect that's working his way up through the system that's got dynamite stuff, but he's a bit of a head case, right? And it's just talking about the beauty of baseball. Now, what holds a special place in this film for me is this is a film that I know if I asked my dad if he were still around what his 5 favorite movies are, Bull Durham would be in that top 5. It's such a told story of an ode to baseball, right? America's favorite pastime. It's so good. There's some really funny, quotable moments in that. I'll never get the scene out of my head of, Kevin Costner trying to mentor, Nuke, who Tim Robbins plays, and he's shaking off his signs that he gives him. He's like, I want you to throw this pitch. And he's like, no, he's going to see it coming. He's like, he's going to sense the heat. I got to throw him the curveball. And then, Kevin Costner tips the pitch to the batter, and he just hits it for a mile for a home run. And he's just kind of standing there, and he goes to walk out and brings the ball to him. And he's like, and he hit that thing like he knew it was coming. He's like, he did know it was coming. Don't shake me off again. It's just such a great moment. And it's such a well-told, ode to, like I said, baseball. And it's one that I will put on constantly, especially before baseball season starts every year. I always watch that film every year.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of guilty pleasures, I feel like, with Fifth Element, with me, and with Bull Durham, with you, it has an emotional connection, whether where you were in your life or the person that's connected with, because I even just thought of another one that I may briefly mention just because of the memories behind it. But yeah, this is one that it's fantastic. There's two things you can really count on from Kevin Costner was he's going to do a Western or a period piece extremely well, and he's going to do baseball extremely well. Yep. And there's a big debate between which one is his best baseball. I mean, you got Bull Durham or Field of Dreams. Like, which one do you prefer most out of both? And both of them are fantastic, but telling two different stories about the love of baseball, about the love of the game.
Well, you say For the Love of the Game. For the Love of the Game is the other baseball movie that he did.
Love of the Game.
I mean, that was also a good film. But yeah, like you said, Kevin Costner loves baseball, so he's made some absolutely epic baseball moments. I will not talk about crying during Field of Dreams. Will not talk about crying for that one. But that's another that could be a guilty pleasure film as well. It could also make it. But yeah, this is such a great film. There's so many quotable moments in that. Like I said, I love that one. I love the scene where they're drinking and they don't want to get up early to play a doubleheader, so they turn on the sprinkler system at the away game and to flood the field so they don't have to play, and they go take off and sliding around in the mud and just having a good time. There's so many great moments in that film, but like I said, every year when baseball season comes, it's one that I will turn on and watch to get me excited for the upcoming baseball season as well. It's just such a well done, well acted film, and like I said, it's got a stellar top of the cast, and even the supporting cast is amazing too.
Yeah, and we love baseball a lot. So sports wise, baseball is both of our kind of top sport thing. Sure. And that's it. And have, so many great baseball movies come out, and that, Bull Durham, Field of Dreams, For Love of the Game. There's a lot that Kevin has done that have been great, but Bull Durham was such a fantastic film. And we might even have some more baseball films to talk about here in a little bit. Absolutely. Which, if we want to go ahead, we can go ahead and talk, because it's on my list too.
It's on both of our lists.
Is Major League 1 and 2. So going from, it had fun and silliness to it, but this is all about silly, fun, goofy craziness. So Major League is one for me. I put these on before baseball season starts. 1 and 2, the third one, not so much. But 1 and 2 were so fantastic. We still quote to each other so often, different quotes from Major League, but, with Charlie Sheen and just those past the Hot Shot movies, which are also guilty pleasures for me, which I don't really plan on talking about here, but his spoof movies that he did were so much fun, and this being the Wild Thing was such a great role for him, but also just an absolute love for Bob Uecker in these movies. Iconic portrayal of he's actually a sports baseball announcer playing a drunken bad sports announcer, which is so good.
He is absolutely one of, if not the brightest spots in those films. He is so funny as Harry Doyle, the commentator, who's, develops a drinking problem from watching such a bad baseball team, right? And the whole premise,
just a bit outside.
Yeah, there's so many quotable moments from that film. Another one that we like to throw in, you trying to tell me Jesus Christ can't hit a curveball, something, some of the most quotable films you'll ever see in your life are these two movies. And we paired them both together because they are both standalone, both really funny films on their own, but they're, two parts of the same, you want to call it universe, but it was very rare for those types of films to get any type of sequel back in the day. And it got two of them back to back within a relatively short amount of time. And they're just so funny. So, so many stars that were in that film as well, because you get a younger Wesley Snipes in that movie. You get, obviously, Charlie Sheen breaking off. One of my favorite parts about it is you hear the story of Charlie Sheen, who, obviously for multiple reasons has had an up and down crazy life, but how serious he took this role, I think gets a little bit lost in the fact that it is such a silly film. He actually trained to be a pitcher to make it look realistic. And they even said, like, when he was shooting the film, his fastball got up to like 85 miles an hour.
Which that day, that was a major league pitcher. That's what they were throwing.
Yeah, it's not like these 100-mile-an-hour flamethrowers that you have out there in major leagues today. Like, I think the average fastball around the time that movie was made was like 91, 92, and he was throwing mid to upper 80s. That's insane.
Yeah, he had commitment.
The dedication that he made to, like, I couldn't throw that hard. And we played baseball. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And just the dedication that he had to that was incredible. I kind of wanted to highlight that. But yeah, this is another one of those. It's on Comedy Central all the time. You throw it on, you laugh. It's so funny. Like you said, Bob Uecker was amazing as Harry Doyle, but he's legitimately the voice of the broadcasting voice of the Milwaukee Brewers still to this day.
Has there ever been a Reds game we've either watched on TV together or gone to, or even because we've started traveling and seeing different stadiums? Sure. Have we ever not had a pop-up go in the air and not say it's too high? It's too high. It's too high. It's too high.
What do you mean it's too high? Yeah, there's just so many fun quotable moments. But like you said, we're big enough baseball fans, former season ticket holders and everything like that, that we'll still go to a game and, just a bit outside, just whatever. We will still quote it while we're watching the game, and it's just so funny.
Yeah, there's so many great quotes and lines and just performances. Even like before I knew him as the president on 24, Dennis Haysbert was Pedro in Major League. And like, it's one of those where, like, I saw that when I was relatively younger, when 9 or 10 or 11, seeing it on TV, because back then a lot of the stuff, even like the police academies and others like that, they were broadcast on Fox on like Saturday, edited for TV, because after you see the real versions that I saw much later, it's like, oh, there's a little more adult than I remember them being. But I would always watch them, always see them on, always. That was just part of our childhood, was seeing Major League, and I still keep it going today. I haven't showed my kids yet because they're not as. I have 2 girls. They're into sports, but they're not into sports movies and other stuff. So I haven't made them sit through it yet. But I just love the Major League movies. So many quotes, so much fun. Just I have to kick off baseball season by watching Major League 1 and 2.
It's a must watch for sure. And I knew that it was going to be on both of our lists just because of how important it is to both. Like, just our friendship alone, like I said, we quote those all the time going to ball games and stuff together, and it's just, I'm so glad it made both of our lists because it's just so funny and so well done. Textbook. You can't see I have a list together written here, and it was the first 2 films that I put on this list were Major League 1 and 2, just for that very reason. Like, when I started thinking about what a guilty pleasure film was for me, Major League is it. It's like I said, I love the silliness. I love the the requotability always ranks pretty highly for me. Like, I'll dive into some more a couple more films that are a little more serious, a little more for like other types of films as well. But as far as comedies go, those are some of my absolute favorites that I'll still quote like to this day going forward.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and throw in another one of mine because I went a little more out than Josh. I put a bunch of films in here. So one I want to talk about real quick that I mentioned, talk about Major League, just because of the memories, and you mentioned Bill Durham with your dad. There's one that I'll never forget. It's not a good movie. I'll admit right away, it's not a good movie. It's BASEketball by the creators of South Park. It's ridiculous. It's dumb. It's over the top. But that is the one movie that I have such a cherished memory of because I lost my dad a few years ago to cancer. And when we first showed him that movie, he could not stop laughing. He was a guy who watched Western, watched Bonanza. He'd watch, kids. He loved Shrek and stuff with us as a kid and everything else. But this is the first, like, really silly, dumb comedy that I can remember showing him. And he laughed so hard, he cried. He had to go out on the deck and take a breather because he was laughing so hard. And I don't remember what it was about that movie because I remember some of the movie. It's not something that... I remember the movie itself. I remember that memory of my dad laughing so hard out of it. And it'll be something now that I do put that I want to put on more, just because it's going to bring back some of those memories of my dad laughing so hysterically at that movie.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I'll kind of piggyback off of what you said, because it's not on the list, but you talk about this core memory with your dad. You say that's like the hardest you ever remember him laughing. The hardest I ever remember my dad laughing in the theater, we went and saw Happy Gilmore in the theaters together. And in that scene where it cuts to the broadcast version of him just cussing out the ball for not going in the hole, and he's just going on this expletive. My dad legit falling over in his seat, just tears running down his face. He was laughing so hard. You unlocked like another core memory for me, just memories of our dads who we both unfortunately have lost, but having that core memory of that is something I'll never forget either. Like legitimately like struggling to catch his breath in tears because he was laughing as hard as it was. So thank you for unlocking that kind of core memory for me to remind me to bring up here, because it's another one of those. Happy Gilmore could absolutely be a guilty pleasure film as well. Yeah. But
BASEketball can be too, even though it's because, as I talked about guilty pleasures, like don't even have to be good movies. It just could be something you enjoy. And like he enjoyed it so much. It was a guilty pleasure of his, at least. I don't think he ever ended up watching it again, because he just laughed so hard. He's like, I'm done. I don't want to watch it again because of that, just because it made him laugh so hard. And it was just one that he was, okay, I've watched it. I laughed. It was dumb. I'm over it, but it was hysterical.
But I love that, though, because we can kind of tie those memories to those types of movies and why they hold such special meaning for us. Because, like you said, you and I have very similar like parallels in our lives of things that have both happened to us and for us, and having some of these core memories with our dads and stuff, like that's one that you said. Our dads even were very similar in the sense that, my dad's favorite movies were, John Wayne Western films. Like my dad had his entire movie catalog, multiple copies of it. Like he loved those type of Western films, but seeing some of these silly comedies, it's where I get a lot of my sense of humor from, and my, outgoing, a lot of ways extroverted personality from him is definitely my sense of humor from him. And just getting it from movies like that and just seeing him react to just some of this absurd, because he loved to laugh at just the most absurd things in the world. And that was one that will always, stick with me as far as, that type of core memory of just nonstop laughter. And it was so fun. So thank you for bringing that up. That was really cool. I don't know how to transition away from that, because the next couple films that I have are not comedies. So I'll take a little bit of a left turn if you want to kind of steer towards a little bit more of a, I don't want to say serious, but it has some comedic element to it. So I'll put my last sports movie on the list, but it's Remember the Titans. Remember the Titans is such a good movie. Like, you got Denzel Washington giving this absolutely incredible performance as Coach Boone, but there are so many other like big name stars that have come out of this film that a lot of people I don't think realize were in the film. Like it's still a pretty popular movie. Like it was critically received well. It even did fairly well at the box office, but it's one of those, like you said, before we get to football season even then, because we're big sports lovers as well, but football season comes around, I put on Remember the Titans. It's got such a wonderful message of, accepting each other's differences and coming together to work towards a common goal, that kind of thing. But there's so many memorable moments in that one. A lot of people don't remember. It's one of the first major movie roles, if not the first major movie role for like Ryan Gosling. Ryan Gosling was in that film, a very young version of him. Like it's such a well done movie that's still like, I think stands the test of time as like not only a great sports movie, but a really good movie with a really good message.
Yeah, it's a great sports film, great movie overall. And something that I haven't seen in a long time, but you've got me wanting to watch it again just because I'm starting to replay it through my mind and stuff that I've kind of forgotten about it over the years. But yeah, it was such a well done movie.
Yeah, one of the things that I can really take away from that too now is when I see like a longer haired quarterback playing football, I immediately want to call him Sunshine, just because that's the nickname they had for, the kid from California that came in and played quarterback and he had the long hair and they called him Sunshine. It was just funny. But yeah, it's such a well told story, and it's based off a true story, obviously. So a lot of your better stories are based off something that actually happened. And it's based off a true story as well, but it's an absolutely brilliant film that I will always watch when, like I said, football season comes around. If it's on TV, I'll leave it on too, because there's so many like quotable moments in that film. Like some of my buddies will, if we're trying to hype each other up, we go left side, strong side, like just stuff like that to kind of hype ourselves up. But it's such a good movie. I love it so much.
Yeah, great movie. Really loved it. To kind of transition to one that kind of holds a special place in my heart for the love I have for it that I don't think a lot of people have seen is the movie Once. So this was a kind of small European Irish film that it did win the Oscar for Best Song for Falling Slowly. So Glenn Hansard and Marketa Irglova are your main stars or musicians, so they're not really actors. And it kind of showed that, it's a very low budget. I think it was $150,000 budget. It made like $20 million, so it made some, based off of the budget, kind of a killing there. Yeah. But I still don't think it's a film that many people have seen. It has spawned a Broadway musical, which I've seen and enjoyed, but it's one that I have to watch every now and then. I still... I play Glenn Hansard, Marketa Irglova songs all the time because he's one, if you're into music with Glenn Hansard, I have yet to really see someone who plays music more passionately than Glenn Hansard does. And you see it in the movie. He's got this old beat up guitar that he's standing on the street playing, and he is just belting his heart out. Like there's so much emotion and heart behind Glenn and what his character does. And the whole movie just kind of follows these two musicians who are, just trying to find their way in the world. And they've had some hardships and heartaches, and they're working in Hoover shops or selling flowers or doing something else. But, it kind of accumulates in them recording an album together and all these different songs. But there's so much there's some humor, but there's a lot of heart. And I just love it. It's a very small, like I said, $150,000 budget, very small film that I don't think a lot of people have seen even after they won the Oscar for the song, but beautiful music. And I just love the movie, just the impact it had on me. And like, I've seen Glenn live with the Swell Season, and I listen to him all the time because of this movie. It introduced me to one of my favorite artists. He's, folk, Irish rock, but he is such an incredibly passionate musician. And I just want to expose people to him, to Marketa, and to Once because it just had that impact on me from the first moment I watched it.
Yeah, and that's an incredible definition of a guilty pleasure film, right? It's one that not a lot of people know about. I full transparency, if you can't see my guitar tattoo, I've played guitar for well over 20 years now, and being a musician, I tend to a lot of times gravitate towards musical projects like that. Like we talk about, some of our favorite films. I put like Bohemian Rhapsody and Rocket Man and some of these other music-based films. Spoiler alert, one of my films coming up that I'm going to talk about here in a minute is also a definite guilty pleasure music movie as well. But it was one that I wasn't aware of until it won an Oscar. And then when I saw that it won an Oscar for Best Song, I was like, what is this about? And then I kind of did a little bit of a deep dive into it, and I finally watched it. It is such a good film. And for the budget, like you said, that it was so... $150,000 in general terms, it isn't cheap. But for a film, that's like shooting a full budgeted masterpiece on an iPhone.
Now, yeah, it's like a Super Bowl commercial costs you more than that.
Right. And it's crazy because, well, obviously not speaking about the advancements of technology now, and there's a lot, cameras are a lot better, but that's kind of the equivalent, right? And it's such a well-told story. It's got a lot of heart, like you said, and it's an absolutely brilliant film, and I'm glad you included it because, like you said, there's so much passion that Glenn Hansard has for his music and everything like that, and I'm not going to expand upon that too much, but yeah, this film was so well done, and it in some ways looks like $150,000 budget.
Oh, film. It definitely does. It looks like a very independent, small, low budget film.
But if you're into that, if you're not into like the over processed, visual effects type films, and it's got very much, because it is. If you love independent films and indie movies and that aesthetic and that the way that they're shot and the way that they're produced and made, I think you'll love this, especially if you love like music to pair with it. And it's such a well done, well shot, well made film that I'm not surprised that it won the Oscar that it did. Like you said, it even parlayed into a very successful musical as well. My first introduction of it was the fact that it was a musical, and then it I found out that it won the Oscar as well, and I'm like, oh man, that's incredible. Let me go check it out. And so good. If you ever got the chance to watch, the show, it was amazing as well. Did you ever get to see the?
Yeah, I did see the musical. I do prefer the movie more, but they did a good job with it. But like, it's because it's one of my favorite soundtracks of all time too. Really like good. Every song that they put out for that movie was just incredible. Like the passion both of them had. And one of my favorite memories I have when I was dating, my wife, is we went to Bonnaroo. And Bonnaroo, we had such a huge mix of artists there because you had Metallica and Chris Rock, and you had the Swell Season. So this was not too far after the movie. And I'm like, I have a chance to see Glenn and Marquetta perform the Swell Season, and they're on one of the smaller stages. They're not making, of course, one of the big stages, but it was hysterical of him on stage. He had the guitar from Once. It has holes in it, broken, but watching him play with that passion in person was incredible. But it was a moment that a few tents down the way, another band was going, and that band was Mastodon. And if you know anything of the difference between Irish folk rock and metal double, triple, quadruple bassing, whatever Mastodon is doing there, it was hitting hard. And Glenn is like, is that us? Was that? It's okay. He stopped the show a couple of times because he was like, is that like reverb coming from our set or something? Like, no, that's Mastodon blasting all the way over there. But it was hysterical, his reaction to like, what is it? It's Mastodon? Oh, okay. Like,
I love it because he could not be on two more opposite ends of a musical spectrum. But that's funny that you had that experience too, because if you know anything about those two bands, they could not be more diametrically opposed. And it's hilarious
nowhere near each other.
That it was causing that much of a disruption. But yeah, like we could go talk about Bonnaroo for days. But yeah, as far as the film goes, that's an excellent pick, man. That is definitely a great guilty pleasure example too, because it's one of those that it's one that not a lot of people may know about, despite the fact that, like you said, it won an Oscar for the song from the film, but it's definitely worth a watch. It's definitely one to...
I absolutely love telling everybody about this movie. I want people to see it. It's, a little older now, but it's so good. It is low budget. It is small. It has so much heart. It has so much passion, such great music. Like, it's just an incredible little film that more people deserve to see.
I love that. So I'm gonna take your music and transition to my music film that made my guilty pleasure list, and that's Rockstar, starring Mark Wahlberg. So it's kind of a play on, some people think it's loosely based on the story of Judas Priest. Some people think it's based on a couple other bands, but it's basically about Mark Wahlberg, who is starting out as a super fan of the band Steel Dragon, right? So Steel Dragon, it's his favorite band. He's actually the front man for a Steel Dragon tribute band, and he gets a chance to audition and becomes the lead singer of this band, right? So obviously it's got Mark Wahlberg, it's got Jennifer Aniston as Mark Wahlberg's girlfriend in the film. It's got some incredible real musicians like Zakk Wylde, who's been Ozzy Osbourne's guitarist for such a long time, Black Label Society, as well as his own band. Very successful, one of the most incredible guitar players of all time. Yeah, amazing guitar player. He's the lead guitarist of that band in that film, and there's some other musicians as well that were incredible. But such a good film. You want to talk about an amazing soundtrack? The Rockstar soundtrack, so good, right? But yeah, it's loosely kind of based. A lot of people think it's loosely based on like Judas Priest because Judas Priest, Rob Halford left Judas Priest, and Ripper Owens, who became the second lead singer of the band, was in a Judas Priest tribute band, and he auditioned and became the lead singer. And then, the running joke for the lead singer is, you kicked me out because I'm gay. Rob Halford is notoriously gay as the front man of, Judas Priest, who's just this iconic metal band. But it's kind of loose parallels and stuff like that. But it's such a well-made, in my opinion, guilty pleasure film, because it did not make a ton of money. It was not commercially acclaimed, but every band that I've ever been in and ever played with, we will quote that movie. We will, scream, stand up and shout, just like quote that. It's such a good movie. I love that movie so much.
That's one I honestly kind of forgot about until you brought it back up again. And it kind of proves of, its placement is guilty pleasure, because I remember it now that you're talking about it, but I had completely forgotten about it until now.
So many, like, you want to talk about epic soundtracks? That movie has an absolutely epic soundtrack because it does have, some traditional 80s hair metal in, but it's the original Steel Dragon songs. So good. So well, like if you love like 80s rock, big arena hair metal, those types of bands, those types of songs, such amazing stuff. Like it's got great singing throughout the movie as well. Like it's about the journey of a rock star, and it's so good.
Yeah.
I love that film so much.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go back and rewatch it because I haven't seen it in so long. Because like I said, I've forgotten kind of all about it.
Yeah, it's so good. It's one of my favorite Mark Wahlberg projects, and it doesn't get a lot of love because, he's made so many films that, now that people talk about more like Ted and, the other guys I think he did with Will Ferrell. That's another one of real quotable comedy movies, and some of the other stuff he's done. It's kind of an earlier work of his. It's even an earlier like Jennifer Aniston film that I don't feel got a ton of love, but it's one that if you love music and you love that, that's definitely one to watch.
When you said Jennifer Aniston in it, instead of thinking about the movie, I instantly went to another. That is a guilty pleasure for me, and you probably know where I'm going. One of her early roles is Office Space.
Yep.
Beating up the printer of Michael Bolton in the group there. That's another one we still kind of quote. They just, I'm going to go ahead and need you to come in this weekend. And that's my stapler. And like such iconic lines from Mike Judge, the creator of King of the Hill and Beavis and Butthead and everything else. Such a great film. I didn't have on my list. You said Jennifer Aniston. I thought Pieces of Flair instantly popped into my mind. Like, did she have her pieces of flair in that movie? But yeah, Office Space is one I loved as well that I would absolutely include as a guilty pleasure. But absolutely. One guilty pleasure I wanted to talk about and make sure I have in here is one that's probably more to the people in the Cincinnati area than anyone else out there. Like it made maybe $3 million in theaters. Sure. Wasn't well reviewed. It's not a fantastic movie, but it's one of the first movies I can remember as a kid that was filmed in our area, that I can look at locations like that's Newport, that's Covington, that's Crone Conservatory, that's Cincinnati, that's Riverfront Stadium. Like I know what this was Airborne. So Airborne is your extreme sport kind of movie. Like you've got a California surfer who has to come live with his aunt and uncle in Cincinnati because they're going off to Australia and they're not taking their teenage son with them. Like, okay. And so he comes to Cincinnati with his surfboard, which, I mean, we don't have an ocean, so you don't need your surf. But this is also one of the first, or some of the first films for Seth Green and Jack Black.
Yep.
Because I remember even one that I have on my list later has a Jack Black in it, that he was barely in it, but kind of seeing where he started and seeing there's one I can't stop laughing as there's a scene in Airborne here where Jack Black is trying to be really serious and he's staring down our main character. And he's just glaring. But the way he looked, like it's Jack Black. I can't take him serious. Yeah. So I'm just cracking up at it. But like, this wasn't a good movie. It ends up transitioning that, well, he's also a rollerblader. And so there's street hockey and, got nice throwbacks to Cincinnati Cyclones classic jerseys. We've got those on and being able to see that throughout the movie and different locations out there. But like I said, that's one of the first movies I can remember. I'm sure there were others, and we know like Rain Man and a few others were done around here. But as a kid of what I've seen, like I remember those occasions. Like, hey, that's filmed here. That's about here.
Yeah, and there's a big hill scene in that film too that I'll always remember because it was shot in northern Kentucky actually, and technically not Cincinnati, which spoiler, we both live in Kentucky, but there's a hill scene that they shoot on, and my aunt lived on that hill, and I remember them shooting the movie there because they had to kind of not be home for the time frame that they were shooting because they wanted to clear out the area for the shot, which understandable. They had to clear the street and everything like that, so they kind of had to leave for a couple of days or whatever. But I remember seeing that hill in the film, and I'm like, man, I've go to watch the Labor Day fireworks show up there every year, and it's in a movie. How cool is that? And it's just, it definitely unlocks some core memories. But it's really cool, like you said, it's an early appearance from Jack Black. It's one of his first major films. And Seth Green, and it's you said, it's never going to make anybody's like popular. It's like you said, at the end of the day, it's not a great movie, but for us personally, it unlocks some of these like core memories of our youth and just remembering, around when that film came out. Cause I was little when it came out. I believe I was only 8 years old, I think, when the film came out. So I remember them just talk about unlocking core memories, stuff that I don't think about until we start talking about these things, but just remembering like them shooting that movie in that area. And just, it's so cool to, like you said, connect the dots of a city that we know intimately, because, it's always easy to say, if you grow up in New York or Los Angeles, it's easy to recognize those areas because they're in so many films. But like you said, not a lot of things that are distinctly from our area where we come from kind of come out in a movie. And it's pretty cool to see that and have that, piece of our city kind of tied to a film like that. It's pretty cool.
Especially lately, we're getting a lot more. Like we got the Bike Riders coming up soon that was filmed, partially here, and we've got quite a lot that's coming up. I think even maybe one on your list. Didn't part of that get filmed in Cincinnati?
I think so. I think it did. It's gonna be fun. We can transition into
go right into it.
So one of my absolute favorite action films. It's one that is critically acclaimed. And it stars honestly two of the biggest named actors in the world, possibly of all time. It's Heat. So Heat is the first film that Robert De Niro and Al Pacino did after the Godfather film. So after Godfather 1 and 2, this is the first film that they did together since. And it's, this incredibly well done shot, really groundbreaking kind of bank heist film that a lot of action movies today draw a lot of inspiration from that one. And I put it on a guilty pleasure because when you talk about like some of these great roles that these guys have had throughout their careers, and there's so many great movies that these guys did, with De Niro, with Raging Bull and other movies that he's done, a lot of them always tend to default towards The Godfather for good reason. Godfather 1 and 2 were some of the most incredible movies ever made, and they're going to top so many people's favorite movie lists. But Heat is one for me that I remember being a little, I think it came out around the time I was a teenager, and I was really getting into movies at that time. Yep. And that movie came out, and it was one that I wasn't technically supposed to go see because I wasn't old enough yet, but it was one of those that my dad and I went and watched because, love you, Dad, you let me watch some stuff that I probably shouldn't have when I was younger, but it's such a well-made movie that you can still go back and watch now. And I don't think people give it the type of love for how groundbreaking of a movie it was at the time, for the elements of that film that you still see in these types of action movies and, cop films and, bank heist movies that drew a lot of inspiration from that. Because you want to talk about star-studded cast, you've got Robert De Niro, you've got Al Pacino, you got Val Kilmer, you've got so many people that were in this movie. If you go back and watch it now, you're just like, oh my God, I can't believe how incredible this movie was.
Oh, absolutely. And it is a favorite movie of mine as well. And haven't watched it in a while. Again, this is another one you're getting me to add to my list of, I'm going back and rewatching all these because it's been so long since I've watched it. But I am pretty certain he did have scenes filmed in Cincinnati and stuff, because I think some of them were controversial of what they filmed in there. And it's like I said, when you're not in a big film area, having a film, especially with the caliber of actors and people that you had in there. And as I mentioned with Rain Man, which you had Tom Cruise and everything Dustin Hoffman, that, that's some big caliber actors to have in Cincinnati, which until recently wasn't that big of a place to film movies. And I'm happy to see more being done, but Heat was so incredible.
It's one that I will find like just coming back to from time to time just to kind of throw on. It's like, man, I just want to throw that on to just watch a great action, well acted, well directed, well shot, such an incredible film that a lot of people like. It's just based on my own personal criteria. I love the film so much that it doesn't get talked about a ton, at least in circles that I see when people talk about their favorite movies. He doesn't really come up a lot, and it's kind of disappointing just because it was such an influential movie for that genre. And, it influenced so many future movies that I think if people now were to go back and watch it, you could draw so many parallels to movies that you've seen that are very similar. And it's such a well-told story. And for my reasoning and my criteria, that's what made it a guilty pleasure for me, because that's one a year. You talk about going and watching it once a year. I will put on Heat at least once a year and go back and watch it for sure.
Yeah, another one that I watch once or twice a year. I've watched with my kids. It's still kind of hard to watch after Robin Williams' passing. You could probably put any of Robin Williams' movies on a guilty pleasure list because he was so incredible. I mean, if you grew up in the 80s or 90s, almost every Robin Williams film is on. Yep, love it, love it, love it. But one that I was surprised it was kind of as critically panned as it was Hook.
Yeah.
I mean, you got Steven Spielberg, you have Robin Williams, you have Dustin Hoffman, Bob Hoskins, Julia Roberts as Tinkerbell and everything. Like, you had a pretty star-studded adult cast in there. And critics hated it. I mean, it made over $100 million. It did decently. It was kind of in the middle of the pack for films. But, I mean, you had prolific director. You had Robin Williams at his peak. And, if you don't know it that well, it's Robin Williams is Peter Pan, all grown up. He's forgot about Neverland. He's moved on. He's got a family, but he's a corporate man now. All he kind of cares about is he's got to make these business decisions and answer his phone and have everything, and he's forgetting about his kids. And so then his kids are taken from him, and he's lured back to Neverland to Dustin Hoffman's great Hook. I think he was a fantastic Hook.
So good.
And Bob Hoskins as Smee was just, their dynamic together and everything was just so great. But, I will still quote Bangarang.
Absolutely.
And do the pretend food and flinging and stuff. But I was surprised when I went to look back at, films I loved, and I'm looking at the more technical aspects of it, about how critically panned this movie was.
Yeah, which is kind of surprising because I love that film too. I wouldn't have thought about it as a guilty pleasure because, like you said, looking into it, I would have thought that it would have, just based on the cast alone, would have been, more well received critically. Mm-hmm. And just reading some of the things that people wrote about the movie at the time, I was just like, what are you talking about? This film is great. It's such a good movie. It's so well done. Like you said, core memories for us when we were kids. That film both came out when we were both very young. I remember, my mom taking me to the theater to see that one because I love the Peter Pan film, the animated Disney film, and just going and seeing that. Dustin Hoffman as Hook is so good. He's so freaking good as Hook. It's incredible.
And I think we're all still just and still in shock from Rufio. No one's over Rufio yet. You just can't get over that. Because, it's a family movie, and it's dealing with kind of adult subjects of talking about growing up and forgetting things and where your priorities are. But there's death in this kid's movie, and it gets you okay. Yeah. That just happened. There's so many memorable things. It's another one of those where you cannot do this movie without Robin Williams. It lives and dies and breathes and everything off of his portrayal of being able to go from this stuck-up businessman to, you see that childish wonder return to his eyes when he's remembering that he's Peter Pan and who he is. And, it's not an Oscar-worthy film, but it is such an incredible film that I absolutely loved from our childhood, and I will show my kids until they don't want to see it anymore.
Yeah, it's such a good film. It takes me to, I recently went to a convention back at the end of last year, and the actor that actually played Rufio was supposed to be there. And he wound up canceling at the last minute, and I was really disappointed because I got to do some really awesome meet and greets there at that one, but he was actually one that I was really looking forward to because I loved him as Rufio so much, and that did have an impact on me as a kid. It was one of the first that I can remember, at least, being, I think I was 6 when the movie came out. Just dealing with a death in a movie was Rufio was one of the first big ones that I can remember. It was oh man, to kind of broach that subject a little bit with me. And I remember having that conversation with my mom after the movie, and her kind of reassuring me you're only 6, you're only, you don't need to worry about it too much, but it had a little bit of an impact on me too. And I wish I would have gotten to talk to him, and hopefully one day, I can meet up with him at a convention and just at least tell him, hey, your performance in that role really approached a very serious life subject with me for the first time in my life. And it was just, I want to appreciate, him doing that. But yeah, that's a great guilty pleasure option.
It still caught me off guard when I realized that he was in Avatar: The Last Airbender cartoon series. Wait, that was Rufio?
Yeah, another reason I wanted to see him too. But yeah, that was so cool. I wanted to talk about Hook with him for sure, because I'm sure he gets enough Avatar questions, but I wanted to talk to him.
And all the millions of stories that we've heard about what it's like filming with Robin Williams, like even like with Mrs. Doubtfire, which is another guilty pleasure, which has serious subject matter to it. I mean, he gives a hysterical performance, but also one that's touching and heartfelt because he breaks down emotionally. Like, I'm just trying to spend time with my kids. You can't take them from me. And like, he gives a kind of well-rounded performance in that. And it was just like, both of these around the same time, like you just got such great comedic, but also drama and heart and subjects that kids weren't really dealing with death and divorce and everything that, or at least weren't being shown and having to deal with it.
Having platforms that big to talk about things like that. Yeah, for sure. Because I grew up in a divorce house. My parents were divorced before I was even a year old, so I knew that life, and it didn't have the same impact on me that maybe people who were a little bit older that went through something similar. So that really didn't resonate with me as much as like, oh yeah, I get that. You know, I go see dad on the weekends and I go, you know, spend the rest of the time with my mom. This is normal. But yeah, like to think about it, you didn't have like those types of films geared towards kids that dealt with some of that serious subject matter. So those are definitely good guilty pleasure for a good reason that unlock those, you know, like we keep coming back to core memories from our youth. And I'm loving that we're having this conversation. We're dedicating this episode to this because there's really good conversations about, you know, how these movies make us feel. And that's what movies are supposed to do.
And that's what most guilty pleasure, I think they have some sort of connection to you, whether it's good or bad or times in your life or meanings and messages that it had for you, that there's something about it that stuck with you. And it's a kind of a part of you that it has that significance that, you know, 20, 30, 40 years down the line, it's still sticking with you.
Absolutely. And that's a great option. Did you have any more like
I could talk guilty pleasures for like 10 hours.
Your list was significantly
I have so
longer.
many.
Your list for full transparency, we have our movies listed out here. His list is significantly longer than mine. I kind of wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of highlight some more because honestly, looking at your list, there are several that I probably could have included on mine too, but was there anyone in particular that wanted to? There is one on your list that I would love to talk about, talking about a core memory of one of my favorite movie-going experiences was, and it's number 7 on your list. Did you want to talk about that next?
Go ahead.
So number 7 on your list, I'll steal it from you, is I love it, is Twister, right? So Twister, incredibly successful box office-wise, was kind of mixed reviewed as well, but that's, you know, it's coming back around to talk about now with the sequel with Glenn Powell coming out in the summer that you and I are both very excited to go see, and you know the trailers for it have gotten me even more excited because it looks fantastic and I'm excited to jump into it. The original was so groundbreaking at the time because, you know, it deals with the natural phenomenon of tornadoes and, you know, these people that are going to, you know, these tornado chasers that are trying to really understand what makes a tornado happen, and if there's any way scientifically we could prevent it from doing significant damage, right? But what would make it a little bit of a guilty pleasure for me is, one, it does have some very quotable stuff like that. I know you and I will do the whole food, you know, thing when we're hungry, but just I'll let you elaborate on it here in a second. And sorry for stealing some of your thunder a little bit here. Talking about tornado movie, making a weather pun, that's what we do. But don't do that to me. Don't make that face. One of my favorite movie-going experiences involved with spending a week with my dad over the summer, the year that this movie came out. And we had this little theater in downtown Bellevue called the Mary Ann Theater. I want to give it some love because it doesn't exist anymore. But it was like it was the definition of a small-town theater, right? It had one showing twice a night for a week or two, depending on how long it stayed. Well, the week that I stayed with my dad, Twister came out, and we saw that movie every day that week that movie came out. We love that film so much, and it's one of those bonding moments I had with my dad. You talk about unlocking core memories. Is we went and saw that movie legitimately 7 times that week that I stayed with him, and it may have been 8 because I think there was one we went and saw it twice. Like, we love that film that much that we went and saw it every day in the theater. It was so good.
Yeah, as Josh knows, I have a fascination with weather. So I'm actually a National Weather Service weather spotter that I've gone through training and stuff with that. I have a weather station, and Twister is one of the big reasons why I kind of got into weather, because I love that. I seeing the tornadoes, and growing up, like, I saw a few tornadoes come down on my grandfather's property and everything else, and it got me fascinated in the weather and everything else, and is kind of a guilty pleasure wise with it because it's not that accurate when it comes to real weather phenomenon, how things are acted. Of course, it's a movie, it's over the top. Twisters is going to be the same way, but yeah, I loved it. I mean, you have Helen Hunt and Bill Paxton, and even one that you kind of forget. Like, I love his character, but you kind of forget that it was him. Was Philip Seymour Hoffman? Like, it was one of his earlier roles, and he Dusty. Was so good at Dusty. Like, he was like, one of the most memorable characters, but then, you know, when you start seeing him in bigger and bigger movies later on, you go back, wait, that was Philip Seymour Hoffman. Like everyone was so fantastic in it. Yeah, we've got cows and all the other stuff in it. Like, it's so much memorable lines, everything else. But yeah, it's a guilty pleasure in core with me because of it started that fascination and love of weather and weather phenomenon and tracking tornadoes and stuff. And I will never forget that there was a, pretty devastating tornado that hit in Crittenden, Kentucky, I want to say 10, 15 years ago or more. And I tracked that on radars. One of the first things when I was really getting fascinated with weather, and I was following it and even trying to put out to people like, hey, you need to I'm sure I only affected my family that was in the near area, but it was from that movie to tracking and watching radar and looking at everything for tornadoes. Like, Twister really got my fascination with weather going big time. Yeah,
and it still stays that to this day. I jokingly call you Doppler Brad because, your love of weather, like you said, but even to this day, I'm legitimately serious. I'm looking at the camera when it says, I will still legitimately get texts from Brad when there's severe weather or even a threat of a tornado. He's like, hey, this is coming. I'll get it before the news gets it. That's how serious he takes this. He'll text me and be like, hey, this tornado's coming or potentially coming. There's opportunities for it. Just stay on alert. Turn on the news, get to your basement if you need to. I appreciate that, but that makes sense that, it kind of started with the fascination of this film, and it was, for its time, a big blockbuster type film. I think that movie came out the same year as Independence Day, I want to say. And it was one of the top 2 or 3 films of the year, box office wise. You said it was a smash hit film. Like I jokingly said, my dad and I contributed significantly to that, seeing it 7 or 8 times in the theater, but it was a big deal when it came out. It was a huge, massive hit for the time. I would love to see those, punch in those numbers adjusted for inflation today, just to see how much money it would have made by today's standard, because that was one that I remember, at least at the time when it came out, a lot of people were talking about the movie. It was a huge, huge hit.
That's what I'm curious to see how Twisters does, if it can have some of the same box office punch because disaster movies did really well, from Independence Day to Twister to even The Day After Tomorrow and a bunch of those going down the line. Disaster films normally have done, other than the ones that get cranked out every other week, have done pretty well. They were our big tentpole summer blockbuster movies, were these disaster movies.
Some kind of existential threat or something to the fate of the planet. Oh, it always works. And that's what big blockbuster type films are supposed to be. They're supposed to have high stakes, and what higher stakes are there than the potential end of the world, right? But yeah, it was such a big deal of film that's a great guilty pleasure one, because if you look at it based on some merits, you wouldn't consider it a guilty pleasure necessarily because it was such a successful film, but by its own merits, until recently when this next movie was getting made, that's one that a lot of people had kind of stopped talking about for a while. But to your point, amazing cast. Cary Elwes is in the film as well. He plays one of the storm chasers, leader of the rival storm chaser group, which is kind of a similar role that Glenn Powell feels like he could be taking up in this one, but may have a little bit more to do with the film than Cary Elwes did. But like you said, Philip Seymour Hoffman as Dusty was so good. He had so many good one-liners in that film. And just the amazing people that were in that film. And it still holds up well now. You can go watch it now. The effects at that time, I think one of the biggest impacts that it had was it felt somewhat scientifically not as realistic, but visually was amazing for the time frame. And it still looks good now. It still doesn't look overly cheesy. You could tell it was made in the 90s. It could look that way and come out now, and I still think look really well.
We just watched it a few days ago. I forget FX or someone was airing it, and we turned it on, and it still looked pretty good. There was you could see the age and stuff to it, but it still looked good. And yeah, I still have such a fun time watching that. Probably, I'd say I'll watch that once a year as well. It's one that I turn on, or if I see on, I'm turning it on because it's Twister.
That's such a great pick too, because I love that movie so much. Like you said, a lot of what they do here talks about unlocking core memories for us, and that's definitely one that I'll hold for that special reason, because it takes me back to summer spending with my dad and stuff. That it's so much fun to go and see that multiple times in the theater because it felt like a big deal and we enjoyed it every time. So I was glad you added that to the list.
I've got two more I want to talk about just because it feels like having a guilty pleasure list without these two actors seems kind of wrong for our generation from 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I know our buddy Wayne is a big fan of these Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone movies as well, the action movies of our time. I'm not going to touch as much on Commando, which was one of Arnold Schwarzenegger's, I guess, less known ones. It came out in 1985. It was only two. I watched it much later than that, but it had a very young Alyssa Milano in it, and he's just basically on a rampage to rescue his daughter, and it's ridiculous. It's over the top. It's cheesy. He throws a pipe through the guy. Like, it's bad, but it's so bad it's good to me. Like, it's pleasure. One of, like, with Predator and a Terminator and a few others, but it's kind of on the bottom of the list for story and everything else, but it's still a guilty pleasure. Like, for some reason it had an impact on me when I watch it as a teenager of just like, this is so bad it's good to me.
But that makes a great guilty pleasure film. That's another one that you could literally say, like, the phrase "it's so bad it's good" comes from like examples like this, right? Where it's like, you know, it definitely isn't going to make a list of top 10 Arnold Schwarzenegger films. Nope. And to be fair, most Arnold Schwarzenegger films are not the most well acted films anyway. But a lot of his films do hold a lot of, like, he was a big deal for a reason, a big box office draw, right? And Commando probably wasn't his most successful film, not even remotely close, but it's definitely one of those you could go in for some of those absurd moments, like you said. I'll never forget the pipe throwing scene. So funny. I actually went back and watched a clip of it, like, maybe a month ago. It was just going down a rabbit hole of looking at, like, some absurd... I was going down a rabbit hole of, like, absurd moments in cinema, and that video came up. And I laughed hysterically for a good 5 minutes, just watching that on repeat over and over again. I'm like, how did they get away with this? And, like, I get it. It was the 80s. There was a lot of absurd movies made in the 80s, a lot of wonderful movies made, and that was definitely one of the more absurd ones, and it's so funny.
I don't watch it too often, but it's one I'll get an itch every now and then. I've just got to watch this ridiculous absurd because it also has moments where he's taking the eye black and he is flexing as hard as he can to put
the GIFs come from.
all over everything on him.
We still use those GIFs. It's so funny. Like, I'm getting ready to put me in and you just go.
Like, I'm going to go rescue my daughter. Give me 10 minutes to apply all of this makeup to my entire body.
Funny, but the film's very much not a funny film, but it's so absurd that it's funny.
The other I want to talk about was Stallone, which you could have plenty of Stallone, which are over the top, and a bunch of others that were not good, but they were good. The one that's kind of stuck with me, like The Fifth Element, is Demolition Man. Demolition Man with Wesley Snipes. You had Sandra Bullock, even had Rob Schneider in one of the first roles that I can remember seeing him in. But this was one I hinted as well, Jack Black. He played one of the underground guys. He didn't have a whole lot of screen time, but it's one of the ones that I remember seeing him in with Airborne. Like, those two were the first ones that kind of introduced me to Jack Black. And you had, Dennis Leary and everything else. But, this post-apocalyptic movie where, Stallone is this cop who will get the job done no matter what. Well, he's after Wesley Snipes' character who has got all these hostages, and he does whatever it takes to take the guy down, but he ends up causing all these fatalities. And so his punishment, both of them are cryogenically frozen and put into prison, in a cryo prison, for their deeds. And then it happens to be that they're unfrozen many years later, while one has been super soldiered to be an absolute killer while the other learns how to knit. Like, it's absurd. It's so ridiculous. Absurd, yes. Me and my wife still joke about the 3 seashells when we run out of toilet paper or something. Like, there, but it was adult. Like, I watched the Fox, like, made for Saturday morning views, and it wasn't until years later in my teen to early 20s that I saw the uncut version with everything, and I'm like, all right, this is a completely different movie than I watched on Fox's. That was kind of a big part of the childhood with, like, Saturday and Sunday movies. Yep. Like you would have on just broadcast TV, movie after movie after movie. That's where I saw Police Academy and a ton of others for the first time, and that's where I saw Demolition. I fell in love with it from the get-go. Of course, Wesley Snipes' star was rising and going crazy, and Stallone was still big, but it was cheesy, it was goofy, it was silly. It had some great action and stuff, but the story and premise was just every restaurant now is Taco Bell. It won the restaurant war, so everything. So now we have fine dining Taco Bell, which I also didn't realize, I guess, at that time, Taco Bell really wasn't overseas. So you can find cuts of it and clips of it where Taco Bell was replaced with Pizza Hut.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was like the international versions was Pizza Hut. Yeah. They had to change out the restaurant for different releases, which I found humorous and entertaining as well.
It's a classic example of that Sunday, heavily edited film that you go back and watch the uncut version like you talk about later. It feels like a completely different movie because there's so much absurdness to it. There's so much like violence and language, especially throughout the film. I think he was getting fined for saying a cuss word. That kind of thing was one of the
That's how he got his toilet paper.
Yeah, he's just throwing out a bunch of expletives just to get the piece of paper to not have to use the seashells. Like, it's so funny. But yeah, that's a great example of a guilty pleasure movie too, because that's one of those. It's like you said, it's not going to make anybody's favorite Stallone movie list. It might, but it was definitely star-studded, like you said. Wesley Snipes' star was on the rise there too. It was pre-Blade, but post-Major League, and it was in that time where his action career was starting to take off from that. And it's such an absurd premise. Mm-hmm. And so funny to watch now. Like, go back, like, if you get a chance to go back and watch it now, and you will crack up. It is such a 90s action film.
I watch it once or twice a year. It's something I always go back to. If I need something fun and silly that I want to have a good time with, Demolition Man is one of my go-to because it is so ridiculous, but I love every second of it. It's so good. Like, the music in it, they're singing commercials like Jolly Green Giant and everything else, and Oscar Mayer Wiener song and everything else. Like, they just went full on out absurd. Like, we had some really great absurd kind of movies during that time, and this was just one that just always stuck with me. It's just insanely over the top.
This is so good, man. I'm glad we decided to do an episode like this. Obviously, I know there wasn't a major release coming up this week, and I know the reason why we're shooting this early is so you can go and take a vacation, well deserved, well earned. I hope you have a great time. But I was glad we kind of did an episode like this because, I love our format of news and reviewing films and reviewing TV shows, which we will get back to next week. We'll get to what we're doing for the next episode here in just a second. But this was a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun, like, taking this walk down memory lane and talking about, some of these films that, like you said, some were big successes, but some weren't as well. But for one reason or another, they either hold special meaning to us, and that's really what a guilty pleasure is. Like, it's one that, we may not always talk about, but for whatever reason, it's one that we watch on our own time that, holds some kind of special meaning for us for one reason or another that kind of like talks about who we are as people too. Because like I said, a lot of these movies that we talked about are either like help, perfectly fit who we are as individuals, like our senses of humor, our ways that we like to look at film, some of our passions in life, like mine being music, yours being weather, like just being able to kind of like have that conversation has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's a blast. I could sit here and talk for another couple hours of different movies because I had more popping up in my head with even Waterworld, which is another Kevin Costner. Yeah, it's another not controversial, but mostly critically panned as one of the worst movies ever. But we saw the stage show was at great. Universal, and it was fantastic. There's so many more I could talk about. But yeah, it's fun to go back because, especially with guilty pleasures and other movies, there's stuff that sticks with you. They hit at a significant time, whether it was as a young kid or a teenager, or something with your parents or a friend or a loved one. There's something about it that sticks with you, whether it was a good movie or not. It had some sort of significant impact on your life, and it's kind of good to go back and revisit that and relive that times, especially as I tell you all the time. Time seems to fly by so incredibly quickly. The older you get, it seems like the less time. Because I remember, my kids are in summer break for school now, and I remember summer break feeling like 6 months long, and 2.5 months, and it's over with like that. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, But it's a lot of fun to go back and revisit things that had an impact on you and that you still love to go back, whether it was good or bad. And we want you to let us know. Come into our comments, go to our Discord, let us know what's your favorite guilty pleasures. Let us know if you actually don't like any of the ones that we had here, or if you have one of your own or many of your own that had a significant impact on you. Let us know. Let's talk about it. I will love to talk movies with you, especially with guilty pleasures, because whether it's absurd or ridiculous or just that impact with family and everything else, like there's always a good story when it comes to a guilty pleasure.
Yeah, let's talk about some core memories. I'm all for it. Yeah, and like you said, we'll get back to our regular format of this podcast next week. But I'm really glad we did an episode like this. Like you said, it kind of gives, if you're following along on this journey with us, like a kind of a peek inside our minds a little bit of how we like to watch movies, some of the things we like to, some of the things we find humorous in films, or some of the things we just like to watch in our spare time when we're not, trying to keep up with everything that's going on in the world currently, because it's so easy to kind of just move from one thing to the next and like, okay, what's the next film? And we do a good job of plotting out of that for this show, but it's really fun to kind of go back and see like how we got so passionate about what we do that we decided to actually start a podcast to even begin with. And it's just the love of film and TV. I know eventually you and I had kind of talked about it, but maybe eventually we do a guilty pleasure TV show. You know what I mean? Or something.
Or even our actual favorite top films of all time. Like
it could
what
be.
we think
yeah,
are
there's
top
so many
films.
different like topical conversations that we could do for this and we could do for future episodes where, there may not be a big time film coming out that week, that maybe we do an episode like that for it, talk a little news and talk some guilty pleasures. I'm all for it. I love this format.
Down for it. Let us know what you think. Do you want us to do more format like this where we're just talking about our favorite films or favorite TV shows? Because I'm sure we can come up with plenty of TV shows as well that may not be, the best or critically acclaimed. I'm still hanging on for Firefly to come back. It hasn't been that long.
Hold tight, my friend. You talk about passage of time. Go back and look and see when Firefly actually aired. It's been a minute.
2002. It's when I was graduating high school. Got one season, then we got the movie, but I've rewatched that the whole series, like 10 episodes. Well, I think it was like 13 episodes with the episodes that didn't air, but I'm probably wrong on the episode count. I absolutely love that show, and yeah, I could go on about guilty pleasure shows and stuff as well. Coming up on our next episode, we have a series that can be a guilty pleasure. It's a guilty pleasure for me that I didn't add on this list that I just now realized I didn't, which was Bad Boys. I mean, I love the original Bad Boys. Sure. It's something I rewatch all the time. It was so absurd, ridiculous, it's fun, very quotable. We have Bad Boys Ride or Die, potentially the final Bad Boys. We don't know. Depends on how much money it makes, probably. If it's going to be the final one or not. On streaming, we have Hitman on Netflix on June 7th, so another where Glenn Powell is in everything. Another, action comedy movie that should be a lot of fun. And then we're heading back into the Star Wars universe with The Acolyte. So we've been really looking forward to this series. It's finally dropping on June 4th. We're going to start reviewing that. I can't wait to check out that series and see what they did with the lightsaber whip and, the first battle of the Sith and the Jedi. That series I have a lot of hope for, and I hope it does well.
So yeah, coming up next week, we will have a review of Bad Boys Ride or Die, and we will also be reviewing the first couple episodes of Star Wars The Acolyte. Very much looking forward to that. Thank you for taking the time to listen to us talk about our favorite guilty pleasure movies. What are some of yours? Please leave a comment on our videos, on our social media posts. You can go to willbringthepopcorn.com to check out our merch, as well as links to all of the other videos and episodes that we've put out so far. It's a great way to kind of be your one-stop shop for everything that we do here. But we're very much looking forward to talking about those things next week. So until next time, I'm Josh, he is Brad, and we'll see you next week.